For a lot of film history, it kinda seems like documentary filmmakers, especially the cinematographers, have been looked down on by real film people. But luckily that's changing these days. Award-winning films like Children of Men, Captain Phillips, District 9, American Honey, or the insanely gorgeous Nomadland have all ditched the traditional Hollywood aesthetic for a more natural and organic approach that have way more in common with a documentary than a typical narrative blockbuster. And for us doc shooters out there, that's very good news. So in this video, we're gonna break down the documentary techniques that are popping up more and more in Hollywood these days, how they're making movies more interesting and immersive, and most importantly, what you can do to improve your own documentary cinematography so that you can put your skills to work across multiple genres without getting pigeonholed. First off, if you think I'm exaggerating about film people looking down on doc shooters, let me just tell you a quick story. A few years ago, I approached a successful narrative DP I'd known since high school and asked about the chances of getting brought on to one of his projects as a third camera assistant. If you don't know how a camera department works, usually the first and second ACs manage the high pressure stuff like focus pulling and slating and building the camera. If there is a third AC, they're usually more of a general helper. Maybe they're running around with batteries or helping to swap lenses or keeping the truck organized during a shoot. A lot of teams don't even have a third AC at all, and more often than not, it's an entry-level gig. At this point, I already had multiple Netflix credits on my CV as a DP, and I had the credits to join the local union as a full cinematographer, and I wasn't asking because I needed a job, it's just because I wanted to get more exposure to the workflows on narrative sets to see if it was something I wanted to pursue. To be honest, I just sort of thought it would be an easy in, but instead he surprised me by awkwardly saying no, that he was only willing to work with people who were, in his words, classically trained. Now I know what he meant here, it's that there's a whole process and hierarchy on sets that takes some time to learn, but I gotta say I was sort of hurt. I mean, I know I don't have a decade of narrative experience under my belt, but I was absolutely overqualified for handing off lenses and labeling memory cards. And before I get into the tips and techniques, I guess I should break down exactly what we're talking about when I say documentary style cinematography, because obviously these huge movies don't have that much in common with a Ken Burns doc where most of the film is just switching back and forth between interviews and archival footage. No, what I'm talking about here is Verite filmmaking, which is just French for truth and basically means that you show characters in their natural environments and encountering real-world situations where the audience watches, kind of like a fly on the wall style. These days it's getting so common that we don't really notice Verite as being all that unusual, but if you look in the context of the 1960s when the phrase was coined, it was way different than the normal movies being made. Now I'm not going to get into a big breakdown of the history of Verite here, but just take a look at a movie like Spartacus, which was one of the highest grossing movies of that decade, and you wouldn't really describe it as observational or naturalistic. Everything's really brightly lit and the frames are sort of obviously set up. And now all movies are set up, I know, but if you compare that with something like the scene in Captain Phillips where the pirates are taking over the bridge of the ship, it feels much more like the camera is just witnessing something that's happening in real life rather than a series of formally composed frames all stitched together. And no disrespect to Spartacus here because it's one of the greatest movies of all time, but it just doesn't really feel like you're witnessing a real moment play out, at least not for me. If you want to know more about the history of Verite, you could check out Mark Bone's video from a couple of months ago that I'll link to in the description. So why is the doc style starting to creep in more and more these days? Well, I think it's because we're so bombarded by media and so much of it is clearly fake or staged. Yes, I'm looking at you, Instagram influencers. It used to be that people went to the movies for something larger than life, but now so many people are sharing every mundane moment of their day, like trying to make a bowl of ramen seem like it was prepared by a gourmet chef, or how they just happened to get that perfect pose at golden hour on the beach instead of going for a swim instead. And I think we're all just getting sick of it and looking for something a little bit more authentic, which is then trickling down to the way we watch movies. The reason Children of Men was such a powerful experience for the viewers was because it felt like we were actually part of that gritty, childless world without it feeling fake. Like if we look at that incredible one-shot scene where the small group runs through the war zone, it genuinely feels like we're in the middle of the action. We don't get perfect cutaways every time someone is hit, we just sort of see it happen in the corner of the frame from the perspective of the characters, and that makes it immersive. And even though that scene must have been choreographed for days, if not weeks or months, and involved dozens or maybe hundreds of actors, it feels genuinely believable, at least to me anyways. And for people who are getting sick of being bombarded by Kylie Jenner's perfect life lounging around pools or pretending to sip coconut water in athleisure wear, it's like a breath of fresh air. And I personally think the demand demand for that kind of realism is only going to keep building, and that means cinematographers and filmmakers who can make this style work are going to be in a lot more demand. Okay, so now let's go a little bit deeper and look at what techniques make for strong verite shooting and how you can incorporate these things into your own work. If you didn't already know, I've built up an entire course around these ideas of documentary cinematography, and it's got more than 12 hours of lessons across 80 videos or so, and more now, I think. And we go deep into scene coverage, professional development, and a lot more. So you can check out the link in the description if you want to get on the waitlist. But for this much shorter YouTube video, there's 4 ideas in particular that you can focus on that will make a massive difference. For starters, one thing you'll notice about good verite shooting is that you feel like you're right in the middle of the action rather than looking in from a distance. Like, let's compare 2 great sci-fi movies, District 9 and Dune. I'm not saying any one of them is better than the other, but if you've seen them, you'll know they give a very different vibe and they don't really feel the same. When you watch District 9, you're always right in the middle of things, and it's part of why the film feels so immersive. Like, you're in the thick of the action when the police raid the alien camps, and to me it makes the whole thing feel a lot more realistic and gritty, which is really saying something when you're watching a movie about shrimp-like creatures from space. Now, Dune, on the other hand, feels more classically cinematic and a little less immersive, and while it's hands down one of the most stunning films ever made, I don't really feel like I'm witnessing a real moment. It feels more like a story being told to me rather than one I'm experiencing in real time, which again, I'm definitely not saying is bad, but it is different. So why is that? Well, for starters, Dune is shot at much longer focal lengths, which means the camera is usually a lot further away from the actors. There's been a lot of articles floating around about how the DP Greg Fraser used a rehoused Soviet lens, the Helios 44, which I think is a 58mm, which is quite a long lens by Doc standards. And when you watch Dune, you can see that they're using even longer lenses than that because there's a ton of compression happening. It's a great look, but again, it feels more like I'm being shown something epic rather than living in the middle of it. Compare that to District 9, and it's a totally different experience. I don't know exactly what they shot District 9 on, but the majority of that movie is shot way wider than 58mm. It's being so close to the characters that create strong feelings of realism and immersion, and that sort of defined the whole movie for me. So what's the takeaway for verite shooters? Well, think wider and get closer. I'm not saying to rush out and get an 11mm fisheye and distort the crap out of everything, but if you're looking to create a similar immersive experience in your film, you might want to try a 24 over a 50, for example, and then use your feet to get closer to your characters. In docs and verite shooting in general, the wide perspective is usually more important than the telephoto, and so keep that in mind when picking out lenses. Sure, 50mm or 85mm looks great for close-ups, but when you're trying to shoot a scene in a tight location, those lenses are going to be pretty limiting and force you to be a lot further away, which makes the viewer feel more removed too. Now, the exception to this is when you want to shoot really close, like an intimate scene or a conversation where there's a lot of emotion and you want to follow people's eyes and really see how they're feeling. But those are specialty situations, and if you only had to pick between a, say, 58 and a 24, you could easily shoot a whole doc on a 24, but I think you'd find a lot of situations on that 58mm that would be pretty tough. And for those times when you really want the viewer to be immersed in what's going on, wide and close is usually the way to go. That's why zooms are usually the go-to for single camera verite coverage operators, and if you watch movies like Captain Phillips, you can even see that they actually incorporated that zooming effect into the final film. But whatever lenses you go with, just remember that close and wide is the way to go for making your audience feel like they're right in the middle.
Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
But what about framing? Because good verite coverage also uses some very specific techniques to increase the feeling of immersion beyond just getting close and wide. Like, how do we pull the viewer's eye into our frames and increase the sensation of looking in on a real moment? Well, that's where you need to dirty up your frames a bit, and for a great example of that, we can look at the movie American Honey. A lot of that movie takes place inside cars and vans, and when we look at those scenes, we can see something really deliberate happening, and that's dirty framing. If you don't know what that means, it's basically just film jargon for having visual elements in the foreground of the frame, usually out of focus. Like in this driving scene, we can see the shoulders of the other teenagers, and we're always like looking over them into the action, which makes the experience more observational, like we're really in that van with them. This isn't accidental, and learning how to dirty up your own frames can be super helpful in upping the three-dimensionality of your shots. Because one of the main challenges for a verite cinematographer, and all cinematographers really, is trying to make a 2D image look 3D. And by placing elements in the foreground as well as the the middle and background, we pull the viewer's eye into the frame. Like, look again at this scene in the van and notice how often there's some sort of element in the foreground of every frame. The DP definitely did this on purpose, and I personally can't imagine these scenes quite feeling so immersive if every shot was a clean single. And you don't need other people in the frame to make this technique work for you either, because you can dirty up your frames with all sorts of things. Like, instead of just shooting straight into a room, try leaving a bit of the door frame out of focus in the shot, and it's going to feel a lot more voyeuristic, like you're looking in on a private moment. The Office uses this all the time to make the show feel more like a documentary, and that's for a reason, even if it's all fake. So if your shots are feeling a little flat, try shifting your position a little and dirty it up. Now, the other thing that all of our examples from Children of Men to Nomadland have in common is that they're all shot handheld. Locked off shots from a tripod also have a place in Verite shooting, but normally it's for more landscapes and wides rather than the meat of the story. And that's great because tripods are a pain to set up and move around. But if you want to get Hollywood level handheld footage, you need to learn to shoot it well. And that means two things to start. First, you need to stop moving the camera from shaking like crazy. Now, movement is a central part of handheld footage, but those micro jitters that come from holding a really small camera are anything but cinematic. You can lean on IBIS or lens stabilization to help with this, but sometimes IBIS does really weird, jarring adjustments as the sensor tries to snap back in place, and the effect can kind of be the opposite of realistic. So what can you do? Well, you make your camera heavier. It might seem weird to try and make your rig weigh more, but a heavier camera makes it much easier to smooth out those shakes and make that gentle, flowy movement of good handheld that's more organic and less mechanical. Bigger cameras like the FX9 are usually heavy enough already, but if you're using a small mirrorless rig, you can try putting some rails off the back and running a V-mount battery or something. Not only will it power your camera all day, but it will make the camera a lot more balanced and smooth out those shakes. The second thing you can do to shoot better handheld is to learn to manually focus, because good Verite shooting doesn't lend itself well to autofocus in my opinion. Not that autofocus can't keep track of a subject well, but really good doc shooters want to use the focus as a tool to move the viewer's eye around the frame, not just keep it locked in one place. You want to be able to flow, to move between elements and make small adjustments on the fly. Autofocus just doesn't really allow that to happen reliably, and when it misses and starts, racking back and forth while it tries to lock onto something, everyone watching will be able to tell that it's a machine making the decisions and not a person. So yes, autofocus is amazing. I love it for interviews and fast-moving action like sports, but for shooting a handheld Verite scene, just turn it off and do it the old-fashioned way. Last up, let's talk about lighting, because when it comes to making a film feel real and immersive, Verite and Hollywood typically have done things pretty differently in the lighting department. All you need to do is take a look at some BTS photos from a big movie set to realize they're using a ton of gear to get the looks they want. And while the end result is often really beautiful, I wouldn't say that it lends itself to that super realistic look that Verite does so well. Like, compare Nomadland, a movie I thought was gorgeous, to something like a Marvel movie, and it's not the same thing at all. And clearly they're not supposed to be the same because they're trying to create different experiences for their audiences, but for me, Nomadland is hands down the better experience when it comes to cinematography. That's not to say more entertaining, because that's totally subjective and it depends on what you're in the mood for. On a lazy Sunday afternoon with a couple of kids, The Avengers might be the more entertaining option, but I don't think anyone watches that movie feeling like they're a fly on the wall of a real story. Nomadland feels completely different. It's way more real, and it's definitely more in line with my personal taste than superhero movies. Some of that's due to the handheld camera work and the use of tons of non-actors, but a big part of it is also the lighting, or the lack thereof. But just because they shot Nomadland using mostly available light, that doesn't mean there wasn't a ton of skill involved in getting it to look the way it did. They didn't just put the actors outside and then start shooting. No, there was a ton of intentionality in how light was used, and if you want to up your Verite shooting, it's worth studying. If I had to pick one consistent thing about the lighting in Nomadland, it would be this: backlight. Sometimes it's a crazy sunset behind some silhouettes of the characters, or it's harsh midday sun coming down over their shoulders, but so many of the great shots in this movie are backlit. If you're not sure what I mean, it's just positioning your subject with the main lighting source, like the sun, behind them so that you get lots of definition between them and the background, so shining from back here. Now, frame after frame and location after location, the light in Nomadland seems to be coming from the back, and that's something that anyone looking to level up their Verite shooting can do that doesn't need any gear or cost any money. money. Backlighting well takes practice and a lot of time, obviously, but just being aware of what's happening should be enough to get some ideas flowing for your next shoot. And I'm not saying using lights is bad either, because you can shoot great Verite while lighting a space, but you just can't overdo it. Whatever lighting you use needs to work with the natural light, like enhancing it rather than replacing it. Less is more, and natural beats stylized in Verite. So there we go, 4 things you can do to improve your Verite cinematography, and my take on why I think it's starting to take over Hollywood, even if it's slowly. If you want to learn more advanced cinematography techniques, you can jump on the waitlist for my course, and I'll let you know when it opens back up. There's a link in the description, and I'll even give you a discount for being early. See ya!